Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I made this Warhammer Titan sculpture, so let's begin! If you've seen my sculpting RM video, these first steps for the armature are pretty much the same. Two pieces of wire that follow these lines and attached here and here with a bit of epoxy. But unlike Eren, this time I used epoxy for the initial volume on the legs and arms. And as soon as they dried, I gave it more volume, but this time on the entire body and with air dry clay. Later on I decided that I wanted the pose to be something similar to this one. Sadly, my smooth brain didn't register that I wouldn't be able to move the waist with the torso being one solid piece, and at this point it was already dry, so I had to cut it in order to move it. But besides that, everything went fine. I moved the joints until I got the pose I wanted and locked them in place with epoxy. Then I gave it even more volume with more air dry clay, and now the figure is ready to receive all the muscles. With these first layers of clay now dried, I started to draw the lines that would help me to establish where to place each muscle of the abdominal area. In this part, the Anatomy for Sculptures book was quite helpful. I cannot recommend it enough. Then I worked on the legs. In this part it was crucial to keep the guide nearby, just to be sure that the size and proportions were right. The arms were pretty much the same, it was just a matter of placing each muscle one by one, always comparing them with the guide so that everything ended up being the way it was supposed to be. So yeah, the same. Something that's important to mention is that I left the back muscles that connect with the neck as well as the shoulders for later. I needed to have the head in place first, and that means it's time to work on the head. I decided to paint the eyes at this point because painting these facial features is always easier without the head being attached to a body, and with that we arrive at one of the most difficult steps in the whole process, making these strips. For this I flattened some clay on this piece of glass until I got a sheet of about 1 mm thick, from which I cut out these tiny strips, and one by one I glued them carefully on the head. And yeah, this step was tedious and hard, especially because they are pretty small. My eyes wanted to roll out of my skull at some point, so I had to take a rest. But after many hours, I managed to get it done. Then I decided to attach the head to the rest of the body, and for that I inserted a relatively long wire into the torso, and at the other end I placed the head, and to secure the head and stabilize the neck I covered the wire with epoxy, and with the head in place I made the neck muscles, the shoulders and the missing muscles from the back. At this point the main anatomy of the sculpture is almost finished, but as you can see it looks kinda fragmented, so the next step is to blend all these seams with clay and water. Okay, now that the sculpture has a less fragmented look, I'm gonna make these little markings here. To make the neck strips, I decided to follow the same process I used for the ones in the eyes. So the first step is to give some color to the neck, and taking advantage of the fact that the brush had paint, I also painted those markings. Like I said, I decided to follow the same process I used for the eyes, so I used the same glass thing and flattened some clay on it, getting a clay sheet of about 1 mm thick too. I didn't cut the strips as thin as the other ones, that's because, well, they are not as thin. Here I decided to glue the middle one first, because it was easier to take the center as a starting point to place the strips on the sides. Placing these strips was way more complicated than placing the ones from the eyes, because the ones that were closer to the center also had to go under the chin. So I had to put glue there, bend the strip, make it go under the chin, and then make it reach the lower part of the neck. On some of them I had to put glue all the way through. Perhaps this was the most tedious part of the whole process. This was sad and miserable. I was questioning my life and all the decisions and actions that led me to this point. I was shaking and crying and I wanted to die. And now it's time to talk about the hammer. It wasn't that hard to make, so I won't take too long explaining this part. First I made, and it's done. Then I made these two little squares that would become the hands and glued them on the figure, and when they were positioned in the place I wanted, I glued the handle on them, and once they dried, I detached them from the body. This gluing the hands thing was just something temporary, with the purpose of placing the hands on the handle. That's because it is easier to sculpt the fingers with the hands detached from the body. After that, it was time to glue the hands back to the body, this time for real. For that, I carved a couple of small holes in the hands and inserted a wire through the arms. This wire was about the same length as the forearm. Then I made this little hook at the tip, coated with glue, then epoxy, then more glue, and finally I glued the hands back to the body. Then I left the epoxy drying for a couple of hours. Thanos is helping me there to keep the figure from falling. That's the one from the 3-pack. Nice figure, a big improvement over the original bath. That one was fucking trash. Later on I covered the seams with clay and water, and finally I painted the whole sculpture to give it a nice uniform color. For the base I mixed a good amount of clay with black and brown paint and flattened it on a sheet of EVA foam, since this clay doesn't stick to this material. I also tried to give it an asymmetrical look and some texture with a piece of sandpaper. As it was a fairly dense piece of clay, I let it dry for a couple of days, and when it dried I marked with a pencil where the feet would go. Then I carved a couple of holes in these areas, and before attaching the sculpture I decided to work on the details of the base, starting with some rocks. Looking at some scenes from one of the episodes where the Warhammer Titan appears, I realized that on the floor you can spot some pieces of broken wood. So to make these pieces I flattened a bit of clay mixed with brown, black and red paint, gave it some woody texture with a needle, cut it into several long pieces and made some details at the ends to make them look like broken wood, and once they dried I glued them on the base. Later I followed a very similar process, but this time my intention was to make small bricks. Then I inserted a couple of screws into the feet and coated them with glue and epoxy, and with a good amount of glue I glued the figure onto the base. I lost the clip of that part, but that's not too hard to imagine, so use your imagination I guess. Now we just need to add a black wash followed by a grey dry brush to bring out the details. And let's not forget about that little cable that comes out of her foot. At this point she was looking rather flat, so I strategically added some shading around the muscles with a brush coated with charcoal. The adherence of the charcoal is not excellent, but a few coats of spray sealer were enough to secure the victory. And that's it! Do you like how it turned out? Of course you do, it looks amazing. I would appreciate it if you subscribe and leave a like and a comment and all that. Yeah, that's it. Bye!